In 1939, when Great Britain declared war on Germany, the first shot fired wasn't a bullet. It was a memo. This memo landed on the desk of Reinhard Heydrich, the architect of the Holocaust, the man they called the Blonde Beast. It proposed a simple, terrifying idea. You don't need to bomb an empire into submission if you can make its very idea of value worthless. You don't need to sink a navy if you can sink its economy. This is not the story of tanks, planes, or soldiers. This is the story of paper, ink, and a weapon so powerful it threatened to unravel the entire Allied war effort before it even began. This is the story of the largest counterfeit operation in history. This is Operation Bernhard. War is, above all else, an economic furnace. It consumes steel, oil, food, and lives. But the fire that burns it all is money. In 1939, Britain's war chest was built on the pound sterling. It was more than currency. It was a symbol of global trust, a note that was as good as gold, from London to Singapore. The German plan, originally codenamed Operation Andreas, was not just to make some fake money to fund their own spy networks. The goal was atmospheric. The plan was to print hundreds of millions of perfect, undetectable fake British pounds, and then drop them from airplanes all over Great Britain. Think about it. One day, you're a shopkeeper in London. The next, you can't tell if the bill in your hand is real or fake. Neither can your bank. Neither can the government. Panic doesn't begin to describe it. It would be economic anarchy. The entire British Empire would collapse, not from a V2 rocket, but from a whisper. The money isn't real. The plan was approved at the highest levels. Heinrich Himmler himself saw the genius in it. But there was a massive problem. British currency wasn't just paper. It was a fortress. It was made from a special linen rag pulp, not wood pulp. It had a unique spectral watermark of the goddess Britannia, visible only when held to the light. It had microscopic serial numbers, a complex running ledger that the Bank of England used to track its notes. And the engraving was art. A portrait of Britannia, so detailed with such fine lines that it was considered impossible to replicate. You couldn't just copy it. You had to become it. The first attempts by German intelligence were a disaster. The forgeries were crude, laughable, and caught instantly. They realized they didn't need a printer. They needed an artist. They needed a banker. They needed a papermaker. They needed a team. So, the Nazis did something unprecedented. They went to the Sachsenhausen concentration camp, just outside Berlin. And inside that wire, surrounded by death, they built a secret factory. They constructed 2 dedicated barracks, Block 18 and Block 19, cut off from the rest of the camp by electrified fences and SS guards with orders to shoot on sight. Then they scoured their new European empire. They sifted through the millions of prisoners in Auschwitz, in Mauthausen, in every ghetto and transport train. They weren't looking for the strong or the healthy. They were looking for a very specific, very rare set of skills. They were looking for Jewish engravers, artists, bankers, printers, and typesetters. They found 142 of them. They were brought to Sachsenhausen and led into Block 19. They were met by SS Major Bernhard Kruger. Kruger was not a typical SS brute. He was an engineer, a technician. He was polite. And he made them the deal. "You are here to work for the Reich," he told them. "You will have good food. You will have clean beds. You will even have cigarettes. You will be treated as specialists. Your job is to destroy our enemy. Help us, and you will live. Fail or refuse, and you will be executed. Imagine the psychological torment. You are a prisoner. Your family has been murdered by this regime. You are surrounded by the smell of the crematorium. And now, your only chance of survival, your only way to see the next sunrise, is to use your unique genius to help them win, to save your own life. You must help destroy the very people trying to save you. This group was called the Commandos, and their task was to solve the impossible. The first problem was the paper. It wasn't paper at all, but a specific linen rag pulp. The Commandos, led by a Jewish paper specialist, began to experiment. They boiled rags, mixed pulps, tested textures. They failed, again and again. Each failure meant a reprimand, a threat. Finally, they hit on the right formula. They built their own vats inside the barracks and began to produce blank, perfect linen sheets. The next problem was the watermark, that ethereal Britannia. How do you recreate something that is inside the paper? The artists studied it, sketching it hundreds of times. They realized it was a dandy roll impression, pressed into the pulp while it was still wet. They meticulously recreated the design, handcrafting a wire mesh stamp. They pressed it into their new linen sheets, and as the paper dried, the goddess appeared. She was perfect. The third problem was the engraving, the portrait of Britannia. This was the true test. The lines were so fine, so precise, that any copy would look flat, dead. This job fell to a man who would become the soul of the operation. His name was Salomon Smolyanov. Smolyanov was not some innocent artist. He was a master forger. A Russian-born Jew, he had been dodging police across Europe for decades. He was a bon vivant, a gambler, a criminal genius who saw forgery as the ultimate expression of his art. He had been arrested in Berlin and was languishing in a camp when Kruger's men found his file. He was, perhaps, the only man on Earth who could have pulled this off. Smolyanov was brought to Block 19 and given his tools. He locked himself away, studying the pound note under a microscope. He hated the task. He was an artist, not a slave. He would later say, "If I'm going to do this, I will do it so perfectly that even the British themselves will be proud." He worked for months, hand-engraving the steel printing plate. Every tiny line, every shadow on Britannia's face. He captured not just the design, but the spirit of it. It was his masterpiece. The final problem was the serial numbers. This fell to the bankers in the group. They realized the British weren't just printing random numbers. It was a complex system, a ledger. Each date of issue corresponded to a specific range of serial numbers. The Nazis, through their spy network, had been collecting used pound notes for years. The Jewish bankers in Block 19 sat at desks, surrounded by piles of real currency, and they reverse-engineered the entire Bank of England's numbering system. They created a ledger that could generate new, plausible serial numbers that would pass a bank's inspection. By 1943, they were ready. The paper was right. The watermark was right. The engraving was perfect. The numbers were logical. Major Kruger set up the printing presses, also salvaged from occupied Europe. The commandos were organized into an assembly line. But Smolyanov noticed one last thing. The notes were too perfect. They looked brand new. A massive influx of new bills would be suspicious. They needed to be used. So they created an aging department. The prisoners were ordered to pass the notes down a line. Some folded them, put them in their pockets, rubbed dirt on them. Others were given pins and told to poke the tiny holes in the top corner, where English bank tellers used to spike their bills. They simulated the life of a bill, from the bank to the market to the pub and back again. The result was indistinguishable from the real thing. Major Kruger, proud of his achievement, took the first batch to his superiors. They were impressed. They sent a sample to a Swiss bank, a neutral party. The bank certified it as genuine. They even flew a spy to London, who deposited the fake notes at the Bank of England itself. The bank accepted them. The test was a success. The money bomb was real, and it was ready. The presses in Block 19 began to run day and night. The prisoners became ghosts, pale from the indoor work, their hands stained with ink. They were living better than any other prisoner in the entire camp system. They had real food, music, even a ping-pong table. But they were still prisoners. They could hear the screams from the other blocks. They could see the smoke from the chimneys. They were living in a golden cage, surrounded by hell, manufacturing the weapon that could seal their fate. They printed £134 million. In today's money, that is billions. It was the largest, most successful counterfeit operation in history. The weapon was built. The fuse was lit. It was time to drop the bomb. But then the war changed, and the Nazi leadership began to argue. The original plan, Heydrich's plan, was economic anarchy. Drop it all on Britain. But Heydrich was now dead, assassinated in Prague. The new leadership, particularly Himmler and his SS, saw the money differently. Why destroy it when you could use it? War was expensive, and the Reich was running low on foreign currency. Greed won. The money bomb was never dropped on London. Instead, Operation Bernhard became the personal slush fund for the SS. They used the perfect forgeries to fund their entire intelligence apparatus. They paid their most valuable spies. When the German spy Cicero, the valet to the British ambassador in Turkey, stole the plans for D-Day, he was paid £300,000. It was all fake. When Benito Mussolini was imprisoned by the Italians after their surrender, it was Operation Bernhard's money that funded the daring SS commando raid to rescue him, led by Otto Skorzeny. They used it to buy weapons on the black market. They used it to pay collaborators and turncoats across Europe. The money bomb never fell on London, but it seeped into the world. A financial poison, but never a killing blow. Inside Block 19, the prisoners knew the war was turning. They could hear the Allied bombers flying overhead, getting closer. They knew what they were. They were Geheimnisträger, secret bearers. They knew one of the Reich's most sensitive secrets. And they knew what happened to secret bearers when they were no longer needed. Major Kruger, the polite engineer, gave them a new order. Begin forging the American dollar. This was a new, desperate phase. But the dollar was even harder than the pound. The paper was different. The ink was different. Smolyanov and his team began the slow, agonizing process all over again. They were buying time. As long as they were useful, they were alive. By early 1945, the Red Army was on the outskirts of Berlin. The Sachsenhausen camp was in chaos. The SS received its final orders. The operation was to be moved. The prisoners, the presses, and all the money were loaded onto trucks. They were being moved south to Mauthausen concentration camp in Austria. They arrived at a satellite camp of Mauthausen, a dark, grim place called Riedl-Zipf. They were ordered to continue their work, to forge the dollar. But it was a sham. There were no materials. The war was over, and they all knew it. In the final days of the war, the SS guards received their last order concerning the prisoners. Take them to the Ebensee camp. Liquidate them all. The 142 men were marched toward Ebensee, a death camp in the mountains. This was it. Their luck had run out. But the Nazi war machine was collapsing in on itself. The guards were panicked, disorganized. They were more worried about their own survival than their orders. When they arrived at Ebensee, the camp was in chaos. The prisoners were herded into a barracks, and then the guards just vanished. They deserted, melting away into the mountains, trying to save themselves from the approaching American army. The 142 men of Operation Bernhard, the men who had created the perfect weapon, simply walked out. They walked out of the gates as free men, just days before the camp was liberated by the Americans. Salomon Smolyanov, the master forger, walked out with a suitcase, allegedly filled with forged currency. He would later move to Monte Carlo and continue his life as a high-stakes gambler and artist, forever a rogue. But what about the money? What about the printing plates? In the final days, the SS had loaded all the evidence, the engraved steel plates, the printing presses, and crates filled with hundreds of millions of pounds, onto trucks. They drove to Lake Toplitz, a deep, dark, cold alpine lake in Austria, and they dumped it all. For decades, the lake held its secret. Divers would search for the Nazi gold. What they found in 1959 was not gold. It was crates of paper, billions of dollars and pounds rotted by the water. And more importantly, they found the plates, the perfect hand-engraved plates of Salomon Smolyanov. The war ended. Britain was victorious, but it had been wounded in a way it never publicly admitted. The perfect forgery was out there. Millions of it were still in circulation, indistinguishable from the real thing. The Bank of England was in a panic. They quietly began to track down the Bernhard notes, but it was impossible. The work of the commandos was too good. In 1946, they had no choice. They did something drastic. They recalled every single pound note in circulation and issued a brand new currency, with a metal security thread embedded in the paper. They had to scrap their entire currency, all because of 142 prisoners in a concentration camp. Operation Bernhard failed to destroy Britain. It failed to win the war. But it was not a total failure. It funded the Nazi war machine when it needed it most, and it proved that the new frontier of warfare wasn't land or sea. It was trust. This was just one battle in the Shadow War. The war for money. But what about the war for information? The war of ghosts? In the next episode of this series, we explore the story of Operation Mincemeat. The time Allied intelligence took a single corpse, gave him a fake identity, and used him to fool the entire German High Command. And we will ask the question, what happens when the machines we build to fight a war become smarter than we are? We will tell the story of Bletchley Park and the human cost of breaking the Enigma code. The Shadow War was just beginning. In the early days of World War II, the Atlantic Ocean was a graveyard. It was ruled by a silent killer, the German U-boat. They hunted in wolf packs, surfacing in the dead of night, sinking ships filled with the food, fuel, and soldiers that were Britain's lifeline. And they did it with chilling, pinpoint accuracy. They seemed to be everywhere. They seemed to know exactly where the convoys would be. It was as if the German High Command was whispering in the ear of every U-boat captain, guiding their torpedoes. In a way, they were. The whispers were being sent every day, all day, by high-frequency radio. Encoded messages. They were unreadable, a jumble of nonsense letters, but they were the lifeblood of the German war machine. They were encrypted by a machine that was, by all accounts, perfect. It was called Enigma. The Allies were faced with a terrible, simple truth. If they could not break Enigma, the U-boats would strangle Britain into surrender. The war would be lost before America even entered it. This is not a story about a machine. This is a story about the minds that broke it. It is the story of a war of ghosts, fought in secret, in a quiet country estate called Bletchley Park. And it is the story of the terrible, soul-crushing burden that comes not just from fighting a war, but from knowing everything about it. To understand the scale of the problem, you have to understand the machine. Enigma was not a simple code. It was a statistical nightmare. Outwardly, it looked like a typewriter. An operator would press a key, A, and a different letter would light up, Q. But inside, it was a marvel of electromechanical engineering. It had a series of rotating wheels called rotors that scrambled the alphabet. With each key press, the rotors turned, changing the entire code. Press A and you get Q. Press A again and you get T. Press A again, K. The German military version had 3 rotors chosen from a box of 5. It had a plug board at the front that swapped pairs of letters before they even hit the rotors. The number of possible starting positions, the number of possible keys, was 159 quintillion. That is a 1, 5, 9 with 18 zeros after it. To find the right key by brute force, a team of 10,000 people checking one setting every second would take longer than the age of the universe. And here was the truly diabolical part. Even if you did find the key, it was useless 24 hours later. At midnight, every single operator in the entire German military, from a general in Berlin to a U-boat captain in the Atlantic, would change their settings to a new random key. The Allies were staring at an unbreakable wall. And every day that wall stood, more ships went to the bottom. The British response was not to build a bigger navy. It was to build a bigger brain. They established a top-secret operation, the Government Code and Cipher School, at a sprawling Victorian mansion in the middle of nowhere, Bletchley Park, Station X. But they didn't staff it with soldiers. They staffed it with the strangest collection of minds in Britain. They recruited mathematicians, university dons, linguists who could think in ancient languages. They famously recruited champions from the National Chess Tournament. They even put crossword puzzles in the Daily Telegraph and secretly timed how fast people could solve them. They were looking for a specific type of mind, a mind that could see patterns where others saw chaos. And into this strange new world walked Alan Turing. Turing is often painted as a lone genius who built a machine and won the war. The truth is more complex. He was brilliant, yes, but he was also difficult, eccentric, and so far outside the box he could barely see it. He was a theoretical mathematician, a man who lived in a world of abstract logic, and he, more than anyone, understood that you couldn't beat Enigma with a man. You had to beat it with a machine. But even a machine would be lost in 159 quintillion possibilities. Turing knew they couldn't just brute force it. They needed a shortcut. They needed a mistake. The key to breaking Enigma was that it was operated by humans. And humans are lazy. They are predictable. They make mistakes. The team at Bletchley Park, led by Turing and his colleague Gordon Welchman, began to hunt for these mistakes. They hunted for cribs. A crib is a piece of text that you guess is in the message. How could they guess? Human nature. German operators were supposed to start every message with a random three-letter string, but many didn't. They used AA, or ABC, or, famously, CIL, the initials of one operator's girlfriend. The daily weather report was another gift. It was sent at the same time every day, and it always contained the word Wetter, German for weather. They knew what was in the message, and they knew the encrypted version of it. Now, the problem was no longer 159 quintillion. It was, find the Enigma setting that turns WETTER into, say, QLPZKM. This was still a monumental task, but it was a possible one. This is where Turing's genius truly ignited. He, along with Welchman, designed a machine to do this hunt. It wasn't a computer, not in the modern sense. It was an electromechanical device, a massive, noisy, clattering series of spinning drums that were, in essence, dozens of Enigma machines wired together. It was called the bomb. The bomb would take a crib, and it would churn through the possibilities, one after another, at industrial speed. It was testing thousands of settings a second, looking for a logical contradiction. And when it found a setting that could work, it would stop. The sound of the bomb stopping was the sound of victory. By 1941, the bombe was running. The codebreakers, mostly young women from the Women's Royal Naval Service, the Wrens, would plug in the cribs, set the drums, and listen. They would listen to the clack, clack, clack of the machine hunting for the ghost in the machine. And then, silence. The machine would stop. A potential key was found. They would take that key, set it on their own Enigma machine, and type in the intercepted message. At first, it would be gibberish. Then, suddenly, words would appear. Clear, German, text. To U-boat 47, convoy HX-122, grid reference 58, sinking. They had done it. They were in. They were reading the mind of the German High Command. The whispers that guided the wolf packs were now being read in a quiet country house in England. The effect was immediate. The Allies began to reroute their convoys around the U-boat patrol lines. U-boat captains, once the apex predators, were now sailing into ambushes. The hunters had become the hunted. The tonnage war, the daily lottery of death in the Atlantic, began to turn. This was the great secret. This was Ultra. But with this incredible power came an even more incredible, soul-crushing burden. The secret of Ultra was not just that they had broken Enigma. The secret was that Germany could never, ever know they had broken it. If the Nazis even suspected, if they thought for a second that their unbreakable machine was compromised, they would simply add a fourth rotor, or a sixth. They would change the entire system, and the lights at Bletchley Park would go dark. The whispers would stop. The war in the Atlantic would be lost overnight. This created a moral nightmare. The codebreakers at Bletchley Park became gods. They held the power of life and death. They would read and intercept. Bombing raid planned. Target, Coventry, tonight. This is the Coventry Conundrum. What do you do? If you evacuate the city, the Germans will know. The bombers will arrive, see an empty city, and realize their plans were leaked. They will change the codes. If you do nothing, thousands of civilians will burn. So what do? You have to use the information without showing you have it. You sound the air raid sirens, but only at the last possible second, when the bombers are on the radar, just like any normal raid. You scramble your fighters, but not all of them. You let some of the bombers through. You sacrifice a city to win the war. Imagine being the 20-year-old analyst who reads that message. You know what is coming. You know that thousands of people will die tonight, and you cannot tell anyone. You cannot pick up the phone and call your cousin in Coventry. You must go to your shift, do your job, and then go to the pub and say nothing. This was the burden of Bletchley Park. It wasn't just a war of logic and mathematics. It was a war of cold, terrible calculation. How many lives can we sacrifice here to save more lives over there? Every piece of information was a choice. A U-boat is at this grid reference. Do we sink it? If we sink every U-boat we find, they will know we're reading their mail. So we have to let some go. Which ones? How do you choose who lives and who dies? The pressure was inhuman. The 10,000 people at Bletchley Park were bound by the most extreme secrecy imaginable. They were not allowed to tell their parents, their spouses, their friends. They were not even allowed to talk to people in other huts at Bletchley Park. The people working on the naval Enigma were forbidden from speaking to the people working on the Air Force Enigma. They lived in a world of total silence. They were seen by their families as shirkers, clerks, or conscientious objectors. They were men and women of fighting age, doing admin work in the countryside, while their brothers and friends were dying on the beaches of Normandy. They had to endure the shame, knowing that they were the ones routing the ships that got those soldiers to Normandy. They were ghosts. And when the war ended, the secret did not. The British government, in an act of breathtaking paranoia and foresight, decided that the secret of Bletchley Park must be kept forever. Why? Because the Cold War was starting. They didn't want the Soviets to know what they could do. And they wanted to keep using the very same Enigma-style machines they had sold to their own allies and colonies. They were reading their friends' mail. So, on VE Day, the order was given. Bletchley Park was to be dismantled. The bombs were broken apart. The schematics were burned. The hundreds of thousands of pages of decoded intercepts were mulched, pulped, and destroyed. And the 10,000 people, the men and women who had won the secret war, were brought in, one by one, and forced to sign the official Secrets Act, binding them to silence for life. They were told, what you did here did not happen. What you knew, you no longer know. You will never speak of this to anyone. Not your family, not your spouse, not your children. Ever. And they obeyed. They went back to their lives. They became boring clerks, librarians, housewives, and professors of obscure mathematics. They just faded away. Alan Turing, the man who had arguably saved the nation, received no parade. He was not knighted. Instead, just a few years later, in 1952, he was arrested. His crime? Gross indecency. He was a homosexual, which was a crime in Britain. He, who had held the nation's greatest secret, was now seen as a security risk. He was chemically castrated by his own government. 2 years later, he was dead. Suicide by cyanide apple. He died a criminal, not a hero. For 30 years, the secret held. 30 years. The heroes of Bletchley Park grew old. Their children grew up thinking their parents had done something boring in the war. They went to their graves, taking the secret with them. It wasn't until the 1970s, when the first books were published, that the story began to trickle out. And the world was stunned. Historians have argued about the impact of Ultra ever since, but most agree it shortened the war by at least 2 years. It saved, perhaps, millions of lives. It was the single greatest intelligence achievement of the 20th century, and it was accomplished by a handful of people you have never heard of. People who were forced to live as ghosts long after the war was over. They broke the unbreakable code, but the secrecy, the silence, and the terrible godlike choices they had to make broke many of them. This was the war for information. This was the battle of the ghosts. But knowing the enemy's plan is only half the battle. What happens when you use that knowledge not to react, but to deceive? In the next episode of the Shadow War, we explore the greatest deception in military history. The story of a phantom army, of inflatable tanks, of fake radio chatter, and of a single spy who convinced Hitler that the D-Day invasion was coming to the wrong place. This is the story of Operation Fortitude. In early 1944, everyone in the world knew an invasion of Europe was coming. The Allies had been broadcasting it. Stalin was demanding it. The American war machine was in full production. The only question was where. The French coastline is 2,000 miles long. From the Netherlands to the Spanish border, the Germans had built a fortress, the Atlantic Wall. It was a network of concrete bunkers, artillery, machine gun nests, and millions of mines, all pointed at the English Channel. The German High Command, led by the brilliant Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, knew the invasion was coming. They weren't stupid, and they knew that if the Allies managed to get a foothold, a beachhead, the war was over. Germany's industrial heartland would be a few hundred miles away. The entire D-Day operation, the largest amphibious invasion in human history, rested on one fragile principle: surprise. But how do you hide 500,000 men, thousands of ships, and the entire industrial output of the United States? You don't. You don't hide it. You move it. You make the enemy look in the wrong place. This is not the story of the soldiers who stormed the beaches of Normandy. This is the story of the other army, the Phantom Army, the army of inflatable tanks, wooden airplanes, and fake radio signals. This is the story of a single, brilliant, eccentric spy who played Hitler for a fool. This is the story of Operation Fortitude, the greatest lie ever told. The Allies had a massive problem. The most logical place to invade was the Pas de Calais. It was the shortest distance across the Channel, only 20 miles. It was the closest port to Germany. It was logical, obvious, and strategically sound. And that is exactly why the Germans had fortified it to be the strongest point on the entire Atlantic Wall. The 15th Army, one of their best, was dug in and waiting. An invasion at Calais would be a slaughter. The Allies had to invade somewhere else. They chose Normandy. Its beaches were wider, but the geography was more difficult, the supply lines longer. But it was less defended. The plan, therefore, was not simply to invade Normandy. The plan was to invade Normandy, while convincing Hitler that Normandy was just a feint, a diversion. The real attack, the main thrust, was still coming at Calais. If they could pull this off, Hitler would keep his best troops, his heavy panzer divisions, held back at Calais, waiting for an invasion that would never come. while the real army bled and died on the beaches of Omaha and Utah. To sell a lie this big, you don't just send a fake message. You have to build a fake reality. You need an army. So, they created one. They called it FUSAG, the first U.S. Army group. And they gave it a commander, the one man the Germans feared more than any other Allied general, George S. Patton. Patton was in the doghouse. He'd been relieved of command for slapping a soldier in Sicily. He was a brilliant, aggressive general with no army. He was perfect. The Allies stationed him in Kent, the county directly opposite Calais. German reconnaissance planes flew over, and they saw Patton. They saw his command center, and they began to see his army. It was an army of ghosts. Across the fields of East Anglia, a new kind of soldier arrived. They were artists, engineers, sound technicians, and advertising men from New York. They were the Ghost Army. They began to deploy inflatable tanks. From the air, a rubber M4 Sherman tank looked identical to a real one. They were heavy, hard to handle, but they could be inflated in 20 minutes by a team of 4. They deployed hundreds of them. They built wooden airplanes and parked them on fake airfields. They built plywood landing craft and staged them in the harbors. German planes would fly over, take pictures, and report back. A massive army is gathering in Kent. It is Patton. The invasion must be Calais. But an army isn't just tanks. An army is sound. The Ghost Army had sound specialists. They recorded the sounds of tank divisions moving, of artillery being set up, of soldiers marching. At night, they would drive trucks with massive speakers into the woods and play these sounds at full volume. German listening posts across the channel would pick it up. Heavy armor, moving into position near Dover. An army also has radio traffic. You can't have 500,000 men without thousands of radio operators chattering every day, ordering supplies, coordinating movements, telling jokes. So, the Allies created a fake radio network. A handful of operators spent their days simulating the entire radio traffic of FUSAG. They learned the fist of individual real operators in Patton's old command, the unique rhythm of their Morse code, and they faked it. They sent thousands of messages a day, all encoded in low-level ciphers they knew the Germans could break. The messages were boring. Requesting 500 tons of bootlaces. Moving 3rd Infantry to grid. It was all designed to be intercepted. It was a breadcrumb trail, leading the German analysts to one conclusion. FUSAG is real, and it is massive. They had built the stage. They had the props. They had the sound. Now, they needed the star. They needed a spy. The British had a secret weapon. It was called the double-cross system. Early in the war, they had captured nearly every single German spy sent to Britain. But they didn't execute them. They turned them. They gave them a choice: work for us or be hanged. These turned agents became the most powerful weapon in the Allied arsenal. They were a direct line into the mind of German intelligence. But the greatest of them all wasn't captured. He volunteered. His name was Juan Pujol Garcia, a Spanish chicken farmer who hated the Nazis. He was eccentric, wildly imaginative, and a brilliant actor. In 1941, he decided he wanted to be a British spy. He went to the British embassy. They rejected him. They thought he was a crackpot. So, Juan Pujol did the most audacious thing imaginable. He went to the German embassy and offered to be a Nazi spy. He convinced them he was a fascist fanatic who could travel to London. The Germans hired him. He moved to Lisbon, Portugal, and began to invent his spy network. He didn't go to Britain. He just said he did. He bought a tourist guide to England, a map, and some shipping timetables. And he started writing reports. He invented a vast fictional network of 27 sub-agents. A banker, a disgruntled soldier, a Welsh nationalist, a KLM airline steward. All of them were just him. His reports were a masterpiece of fiction. He mixed real, verifiable information that he got from the tourist guide with brilliant, plausible lies. The Germans loved it. They were paying him thousands of dollars. They gave him the code name Arabelle. By 1942, the British finally realized what was happening. This Agent Arabelle the Germans trusted was just one guy in Lisbon making it all up. They smuggled him into Britain, gave him the code name Garbo, because he was the greatest actor in the world. And they gave him a handler. For the next 2 years, Garbo and his handler built his fictional spy network for real. The British Secret Service fed him information. Scraps of real, low-level intelligence mixed with massive, landscape-altering lies. The Germans trusted Garbo completely. He was their most valuable asset. Their eyes and ears in Britain. Now, it was 1944, and Garbo was about to give his greatest performance. He began to send a flurry of messages to his German handlers. My agent in Kent reports a new American Army group, FUSAG. My agent in the harbor has seen Patton himself. The radio traffic is immense. They are preparing. He was feeding them the lie, and they were eating it. They believed him. The German High Command, all the way up to Hitler, was convinced that Garbo's network was real, and that his information was gold. The lie was set. The Phantom Army was in place. The ghost in the machine, Garbo, was sending his signals. On June 5, 1944, the real invasion fleet, the largest in history, set sail for Normandy. Garbo sent his most important message. He told his handlers that his agents had seen the invasion fleet leaving, but that this was a diversion. It was the feint. The real army, Patton's FUSAG, was still in Kent, waiting to strike at Calais. On the morning of June 6, 1944, the D-Day landings began. All hell broke loose on the beaches of Normandy. The Americans at Omaha Beach were being cut to ribbons. The fighting was desperate. The beachhead was fragile. A single, powerful counterattack by German panzers could have driven them all back into the sea. And where were the panzers? They were at Calais. The German 15th Army, the panzer divisions, sat and waited. Hitler's generals were screaming at him, "This is the invasion! It's Normandy! Release the panzers! Send them to Normandy!" But Hitler refused. He was listening to his most trusted spy, Arabelle. He was looking at the aerial photos of the Phantom Army in Kent. He knew that Normandy was the trick, that Patton was coming for Calais. For 24 hours, he waited. For 48 hours, he waited. For 7 crucial weeks, Hitler kept the 15th Army and its panzers at Calais, waiting for a ghost army that did not exist. Those weeks were everything. It was the time the Allies needed to land 1 million men, to build their artificial harbors, to secure the beachhead. By the time Hitler finally realized he had been duped, it was too late. The foothold was secure. The war in Europe was lost for Germany. It was the perfect lie. But this lie, like the ultra-secret, came at a terrible human cost. To make the lie believable, you couldn't just have fake tanks. You had to make Calais seem like the target. So, in the weeks leading up to D-Day, Allied bombers pounded the Pas de Calais. They dropped more bombs on the fake target than they did on the real one. They had to. It was part of the illusion. They had to destroy the roads, the bridges, the railways leading to Calais. And in doing so, they killed thousands of French civilians. The very people they were trying to liberate were being sacrificed to make the lie convincing. It is a chilling calculation. How many civilians at Calais is one soldier at Normandy worth? It is the same awful, godlike arithmetic of Bletchley Park. It is the cold, hard logic of the Shadow War. And what of the Star? What of Garbeau? 2 months after D-Day, the Germans were still so convinced of his loyalty that they awarded him the Iron Cross, the highest medal, for extraordinary service to the Reich. At the same time, the British, secretly, made him a member of the Order of the British Empire. Juan Pujol Garcia, Garbeau, is the only person in history to be decorated by both sides in World War II. After the war, his life was in danger. The surviving Nazis would hunt him as a traitor. So, the British government faked his death. They announced he had died of malaria in Africa. He vanished. He moved to Venezuela, opened a small bookshop, and lived in total, anonymous silence for 40 years. He was another ghost, another hero forced to erase himself. The grand deception, Operation Fortitude, worked. It saved countless lives on D-Day, at the cost of others. It was a war of the mind, fought with rubber, speakers, and the imagination of a Spanish chicken farmer. But this grand strategic lie was only one part of the puzzle. While the phantoms of Fusag held the panzers in place, another, real shadow war was being fought behind the lines. While Garbeau was sending fake messages, real agents were setting real explosives. In the next episode of the Shadow War, we meet the saboteurs, the assassins, the men and women of the SOE, the Special Operations Executive, the Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare, who were dropped into occupied France to light a fire and set Europe ablaze. In the summer of 1940, Hitler danced a jig in Paris. France had fallen. The British Army had been humiliatingly evacuated from Dunkirk. Europe was lost. From the cliffs of Dover, Britain looked out at a continent that was now, in its entirety, the enemy. Conventional war was impossible. The army was broken, its equipment left rusting on French beaches. The island was alone, bracing for an invasion it likely could not stop. In this moment of total desperation, Prime Minister Winston Churchill did something radical. He did something un-British. He decided that if Britain could not fight a gentleman's war on the battlefield, it would fight an ungentlemanly one everywhere else. He penned a memo to his cabinet, a memo that would give birth to a new kind of warfare. He called for the creation of a new organization. Its mission: to coordinate all action by way of subversion and sabotage in the enemy-occupied countries. Its goal, in his famous words, was to set Europe ablaze. This was not MI6. This was not the polite gathering of intelligence. This was a ministry of mayhem. It was officially named the Special Operations Executive, or SOE. To those on the inside, it had another name: the Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare. This is the story of that ministry. The story of the agents they recruited, the locksmiths, the teachers, the poets, and the princesses that they dropped from airplanes into the dark. This is the story of the invisible army, the saboteurs and assassins who fought a war of railway tracks, of whispered messages, and of plastic explosives. A war where the life expectancy of a radio operator was just 6 weeks. The SOE set up shop at 64 Baker Street in London. They were the irregulars. They were seen by the old boys at MI6 and the War Office as a rogue outfit of amateurs and criminals. And they were. They didn't recruit soldiers. They recruited people who could move like ghosts. People who spoke perfect, unaccented French, or Polish, or Norwegian. They recruited people who knew how to pick a lock, how to forge a document, how to kill a man from behind with a piece of wire. And, most radically of all, they recruited women. The thinking was simple. In occupied Europe, every able-bodied man was a suspect. They were subject to spot checks, to conscription for labor, to immediate arrest. But a woman on a bicycle, with a basket of bread, she was invisible. She could move through checkpoints. She could carry messages. She could hide a radio transmitter. The recruits were sent to a series of secret finishing schools across the British countryside. At Station 17, they learned the silent kill. At another, they learned to derail a train, not with a massive bomb, but with a tiny, precisely placed charge of a brand-new invention, plastic explosive. They were given toys from the mad scientists of Section 15, fountain pens that fired a single bullet, exploding rats to be placed in coal piles at German factories, the well rod, a pistol so quiet it made little more than a hiss. And they were given the well bike, a tiny, collapsible motorcycle that could be dropped in a parachute canister, allowing an agent to land, unfold their bike, and be miles away by dawn. Above all, they were given the B Mark II radio, the suitcase radio. This was their lifeline, and it was their death sentence. The German occupation was not just soldiers, it was a state of terror, run by the Gestapo and the Sicherheitsdienst, or SD. And they had perfected the science of radio direction finding. The moment an agent opened that suitcase and began to tap out a message in Morse code, the clock started. German detector vans, disguised as laundry trucks or ambulances, would begin to triangulate. They would measure the signal strength, their antennas spinning. The agent had, maybe, 20 minutes. Send your message, pack your bag, and run. If you stay too long, if you transmit from the same place twice, you would hear the heavy knock on the door. You would hear the boots on the stairs. The average life expectancy of an SOE radio operator in France was 6 weeks. They were flying on one-way missions. They knew it, and they went anyway. Her name was Noor Inayat Khan. She was the most unlikely spy in the history of warfare. She was, literally, a princess. A direct descendant of Indian royalty. She was raised in Paris, a musician, a poet, a writer of children's stories, and she was a pacifist. She was a Sufi Muslim who believed deeply in nonviolence. When France fell, she fled to England. But this pacifist, this gentle poet, felt a burning, overwhelming need to do something. She hated the Nazi ideology. She volunteered, and her perfect, unaccented French and her skill with a radio made her a prime candidate for the SOE. Her instructors were terrified for her. She was clumsy. She was quiet. She was, by all accounts, too nice. She was not overburdened with brains, according to one report. They were afraid she wouldn't last a day. But beneath that gentle exterior was a core of pure steel. In June of 1943, she was given her code name, Madeleine. She was flown to France and parachuted into the dark. Her job, to be the radio operator for the Prosper Network, the largest and most important SOE network in Paris. She arrived at the exact moment it was collapsing. Within 10 days of her landing, a German double agent had betrayed the entire network. The Gestapo swept through Paris. They arrested everyone, the leader, the couriers, the safe housekeepers, everyone. Noor was suddenly, terrifyingly, alone. Her handlers in London sent her a frantic message. "Your network is blown. Abort. Return to England. We are sending a plane." Noor refused. She sent a message back. She knew the risk. But she was now the only radio link between London and the entire resistance movement in northern France. If she left, the network would go dark. Perhaps for good. So, she stayed. And she ran. For the next 4 months, this clumsy, nice girl became the most wanted woman in Paris. She played a deadly game of cat and mouse with the Gestapo. She carried the 30-pound suitcase radio everywhere. She never transmitted from the same place twice. She dyed her hair. She changed her identity. She moved from attic to safe house to apartment, transmitting, all the while knowing the detector vans were hunting her. She did the work of 6 radio operators, alone. The Gestapo became obsessed with her, this mysterious Nora Baker, as they knew her. They couldn't believe that a woman was this good. But the net always closes. In October 1943, she was betrayed. Not by a German, but by a French woman, the sister of a network leader, allegedly for money. The Gestapo burst into her apartment. They found her with her radio, mid-transmission, but Noor was not done fighting. This pacifist fought like a tiger. She kicked, she bit, she screamed. It took 2 large Gestapo agents to subdue her. She was taken to the SD headquarters at 84 Avenue Foch. And there, the torture began. They beat her. They starved her. They tried every psychological trick. They wanted her codes. They wanted her contacts. Noor said nothing. She told them her name, her rank, and nothing else. She was so uncooperative, so defiant, that she did something few other prisoners ever did. She escaped. She and 2 other prisoners managed to pick the locks of their cells and climb onto the roof. It was a desperate, doomed attempt. They were recaptured within hours. The Gestapo was furious. They declared her highly dangerous. She was chained in solitary confinement for 10 months, and still she said nothing. In September 1944, with the Allies landing in France, she was transferred to the Dachau concentration camp. On the morning of September 13th, she was taken from her cell, forced to kneel, and a Gestapo officer named Wilhelm Ruppert shot her in the back of the head. Her last word, spoken to her executioner, was "Liberté." Noor Inayat Khan's mission was a failure. Her network was destroyed. But her war was a victory. She, alone, kept the resistance alive. And her courage, her absolute, unbreakable will, proved that the ungentlemanly war was not just about sabotage. It was about spirit. But what about the sabotage? What about setting Europe ablaze? While Noor was fighting her lonely war in Paris, a different kind of war was being waged in the frozen mountains of Norway. This war was not for intelligence. It was for a bucket of water. But it was heavy water, deuterium oxide. the one substance that could be used as a moderator in a Nazi atomic bomb. In a remote fortified factory in Vemork, Norway, built on the side of an icy gorge, the Germans were producing heavy water, and the Allies knew it. This was a threat not just to a city, but to the world. The plant had to be destroyed. The SOE, working with Norwegian commandos who had fled to Britain, devised a plan. A full-scale bombing raid was too risky. The plant was small, the gorge was deep, and a stray bomb might hit the nearby civilian village. It had to be an inside job. A team on the ground. This was Operation Gunnerside. In February 1943, a small team of 6 Norwegian SOE-trained commandos parachuted onto the frozen Hardanger Plateau in the middle of a blizzard. It was one of the most hostile environments on Earth. Their leader was Joachim Runeberg. He was 23 years old. For days, they skied through the blizzard, surviving on lichen and a single deer they managed to shoot. They finally linked up with another small team that had been hiding in the mountains for months. They looked at the target, the Vemork plant. It was a fortress. It was perched on a 600-foot sheer cliff. The only way in was across a single, narrow, heavily guarded bridge. It was impossible. So, Runeberg made a decision. They would not attack the bridge. They would climb the gorge. In the dead of night, in a howling blizzard, the team, carrying 50 pounds of explosives each, began their descent. They climbed down the sheer, ice-covered cliff, crossed the frozen river, and began to climb up the other side. The German guards on the bridge never even looked. Why would they? No one was insane enough to climb the gorge. At midnight, the team was inside the factory perimeter. They found a small cable duct and crawled, one by one, into the main production facility. They surprised a single Norwegian caretaker who was, thankfully, cooperative. They set their charges, plastic explosives, on the delicate heavy water production cells. They lit the fuses, 30-second fuses, and they ran. As they ran from the factory, they heard a fuff, not a loud explosion, just a dull, muffled bang. The explosives had worked perfectly. They had ruptured the cells, spilling the priceless heavy water all over the floor. The team vanished back into the gorge just as the sirens began to wail. They split up. They skied for 2 weeks, 250 miles, all the way to neutral Sweden. Every single man escaped. When the German High Command inspected the damage, they were impressed. They called it the most splendid coup of the war. They had no idea what had been lost. Operation Gunnerside had single-handedly ended the Nazi atomic bomb program. They never recovered. They never got the heavy water they needed. This was the SOE at its best. Surgical, brilliant, ungentlemanly. But this kind of war came at a cost that went far beyond the lives of the agents. As D-Day approached, as we saw in the last episode, the SOE's mission in France became total. Plan Verte was to cut the railways. Plan Bleu to cut the power. Plan Violet to cut the communications. On the night of June 5, 1944, the BBC broadcast a series of personal messages, nonsense phrases. The giraffe has a long neck. It is hot in the Suez. These were the go codes. And all across France, the French resistance, the Maquis, armed and trained by the SOE, rose up. It was total war. They blew 500 railway lines in a single night. They cut communications. They delayed the panzer divisions, like the Das Reich division that was racing to Normandy. They were the 5th Army. They did help win the beachhead, but the price was unimaginable. The Nazi response was not war. It was terror. In the village of Oradour-sur-Glane, the SS, in reprisal for resistance activity, rounded up the entire village. They locked the women and children in the church and set it on fire. They machine-gunned the men. 642 civilians murdered in an afternoon. This was the price. And in no place was that price higher than in Poland. The Polish Home Army, the Armia Krajowa, was the largest, most sophisticated resistance movement in all of Europe. They had their own secret state, their own courts, their own schools. In August 1944, as the Red Army, the Soviets, were approaching the gates of Warsaw, the Home Army rose up. This was the Warsaw Uprising. They rose to liberate their own city before the Soviets liberated it for them. They wanted to greet the Red Army as hosts, not as subjects. For 63 days, they fought. They fought the Wehrmacht. They fought the SS. They fought with rifles against tanks. They fought in the sewers, and the Red Army, on the other side of the Vistula River, stopped. Stalin gave the order to halt. He watched. He watched as the Nazis systematically leveled the city of Warsaw, block by block by block. He watched as the SS slaughtered 200,000 civilians. He was letting the Germans do his dirty work. He was letting them eliminate the true Polish patriots so that he could install his own puppet government after the war. The Warsaw Uprising was the single greatest act of resistance in the entire war, and it was a political and human catastrophe. It was the ultimate tragic cost of the invisible war. The SOE and the resistance, it worked. It tied down hundreds of thousands of German troops. It sabotaged the war machine. It provided the intelligence for ultra and the deception for fortitude. But it was a war fought by amateurs, by poets, by women, and by patriots. And it was paid for in basements like 84 Avenue Foch, in villages like Oradour-sur-Glane, and in the sewers of Warsaw. But while the occupied were fighting the Nazis in the streets, a different, even more secret war was being fought inside Germany. What about the Germans who hated Hitler? What about the generals who knew he was driving their country into the abyss? In the next episode of the Shadow War, we go inside the Reich. We meet the conspirators, the spies inside the German High Command, the men who tried, again and again, to kill Adolf Hitler. This is the story of the Black Orchestra. For 4 hours, we have been on the outside, looking in. We have seen the war fought by the Allies, by the codebreakers, the liars, and the saboteurs. We have seen the resistance of the occupied, the French, the Poles, the Norwegians. But what if your country is the monster? What if you wear the uniform of the regime you despise? What if, to save your nation, you must commit its greatest crime? High treason? This is not the story of the Allied war. This is the story of the German war against Hitler. It was a war fought in whispers, in coded memos, in hunting lodges, and in the very halls of the High Command. The Gestapo called this conspiracy the Schwarze Kapelle, the Black Orchestra, and its members were not communists or students or foreign spies. They were the elite. They were the aristocracy. They were colonels, generals, and the head of Hitler's entire military intelligence service. This is the story of the men who tried, again and again, and again, to kill Adolf Hitler. To understand the Black Orchestra, you must first understand the German paradox. These men were not heroes of democracy. Many of them were old-school Prussian aristocrats. They were nationalists. They were patriots. They had welcomed Hitler at first. They saw him as the man who would rebuild Germany from the ashes of World War I. They were wrong. They watched in horror as he dismantled the state, murdered his rivals in the Night of the Long Knives, and replaced the rule of law with the rule of the SS. They didn't hate him because he was a dictator. They hated him because he was a bad dictator, a gutter snipe, a corporal who was driving their Germany into a suicidal, immoral, unwinnable war. The heart of this early conspiracy was not in the army. It was in the Abwehr, German military intelligence. And its leader was one of the most enigmatic figures of the entire war, Admiral Wilhelm Canaris. Canaris was a ghost, a small man with a quiet stammer who loved his dogs. He was Hitler's spy master, and he hated Adolf Hitler. He ran the Abwehr as a private kingdom, and he staffed it with his own kind, old-school conservatives, monarchists, and anti-Nazis. His second-in-command, General Hans Oster, was even more direct. Oster was the operational soul of the conspiracy. From 1938, Canaris and Oster were traitors. When Hitler planned to invade Czechoslovakia, it was Canaris and Oster who leaked the entire plan to MI6 in London. They were begging the British to stand up to Hitler. They believed that if the Allies showed force, the German generals would have the backbone to rise up, arrest Hitler, and stop the war before it began. And what did the Allies do? They signed the Munich Agreement. They gave Hitler Czechoslovakia. Neville Chamberlain returned to London, waving a piece of paper, promising peace for our time. He had, unknowingly, cut the legs out from under the German resistance. The plot collapsed. Hitler had won without firing a shot. He looked like a genius. The generals who had considered a coup now looked like fools. The Black Orchestra was forced into silence. The war began. Poland fell. France fell. Canaris and Oster were forced to do their jobs. They ran spy rings. They gathered intelligence. And all the while, they were working in the shadows. They were, as one historian called it, traitors on a tightrope. They were trying to lose the war, slowly, without being caught. But as the war machine ground on, as it moved east into Russia, the nature of the conspiracy changed. It was no longer a political disagreement. It became a moral imperative. The conspirators on the Eastern Front were watching the Einsatzgruppen. They were witnessing the industrial-scale slaughter, the massacres of Jews, of Poles, of Russian civilians. This was not war. This was extermination. A new generation of officers was forged in this fire, and their leader was Major General Henning von Treschow. Treschow was the very definition of a Prussian officer. Disciplined, brilliant, from a long military family. And he was a man of deep moral conviction. He saw what was happening, and he decided that the oath to Adolf Hitler was an oath to a demon. He said, famously, God promised Abraham he would not destroy Sodom if just 10 righteous men could be found. We must prove that we are those men. Treschow turned his command, Army Group Center, into the new heart of the resistance, and they decided the time for a coup was over. The only solution was assassination. They tried everything. In 1943, when Hitler flew to Treschow's headquarters, they had a plan. They had a bomb disguised as 2 bottles of Cointreau, a gift for an officer at Hitler's HQ. The bomb was on a 30-minute acid-eaten fuse. Treschow's adjutant, Fabian von Schlabrendorf, placed the package on Hitler's plane. He and Treschow waited. They waited for the news. Hitler's plane has crashed. The news never came. Hitler's plane landed safely at the Wolf's Lair. Treschow and Schlabrendorf were in a state of cold, mind-numbing terror. Not only had the plot failed, but the bomb, the evidence, was on a plane in Hitler's headquarters. Schlabrendorf had to make the most terrifying phone call of his life. He called Hitler's HQ and asked for the package back. He had accidentally given the wrong bottles. He flew to the Wolf's Lair, retrieved the Cointreau, and went into a bathroom. He opened the package. The fuse had worked. The acid had eaten the wire. The detonator had fired. But the bomb had not exploded. Why? It was too cold. The extreme cold of the unheated cargo hold had frozen the chemical explosive. They had been saved by the weather. A week later, they tried again. A suicide bombing at a hero's memorial. The bomber was to wrap his arms around Hitler and blow them both up. At the last minute, Hitler changed his schedule. He stayed for only 5 minutes. The bomber couldn't get close. The Black Orchestra was failing. They were cursed. They needed a new plan, a new kind of plan, and they needed a new man. The plan was called Operation Valkyrie. Valkyrie was a real German operational plan. It was designed by the Reserve Army to maintain control of Germany in the event of a civilian uprising, or if Allied bombing killed Adolf Hitler. It was a plan to deploy the Reserve Army to seize control of Berlin, to arrest civilian leaders, to secure the government quarter. Treschow and his new co-conspirator, General Friedrich Olbricht, looked at this plan and had a brilliant, treasonous idea. They wouldn't fight the plan. They would hijack it. They would kill Hitler. And then they would immediately trigger Operation Valkyrie. They would tell the Reserve Army that the SS had tried to stage a coup and that they, the regular army, were the loyalists. They would use the Reich's own emergency plan to destroy the Reich. It was genius, but it required two things: a man to change the Valkyrie orders, and a man to kill Hitler. In 1943, they found their man. His name was Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg. Stauffenberg was the perfect conspirator. He was a hero. He was a young, dashing, aristocratic officer. He had fought in Africa. He had been wounded horribly. He had lost his left eye, his right hand, and 2 fingers on his left hand. He was a martyr, a walking symbol of German sacrifice, and he had access. As a wounded hero, he was promoted. He was made Chief of Staff for the Reserve Army, the very army that controlled Operation Valkyrie. He was the only man who could both modify the plan and deliver the bomb. He was the man with 3 fingers who would have to arm a 10-minute fuse with his own hands. The plan was set for July 20th, 1944. The location, the Wolf's Lair, Hitler's secret headquarters in East Prussia. Stauffenberg flew to the meeting. In his briefcase were 2 2-pound blocks of British plastic explosive. But the curse of the Black Orchestra struck again. The meeting was scheduled for 1 p.m., but it was moved up to 12:30 p.m. because Hitler was expecting a visit from Mussolini. This cut Stauffenberg's time. He went to a private room with his adjutant to arm the bombs. He was an officer with 3 fingers, trying to crush a glass acid vial with a pair of pliers. It was agonizingly slow. He armed the first bomb, but before he could arm the second, a guard knocked on the door. "The meeting is starting, Herr Oberst. The Führer is waiting." Stauffenberg had to make a choice: go with 1 bomb or abort. He chose 1. He left the second bomb with his adjutant, the second fatal flaw. The meeting was moved. It was a hot day. The meeting was supposed to be in Hitler's concrete underground bunker, but it was moved to a wooden conference hut above ground. A hut with all the windows open. A concrete bunker would have contained the blast and multiplied its force. A wooden hut would dissipate it. Stauffenberg walked into the hut. 24 men were gathered around a massive, heavy oak map table. He placed his briefcase under the table, about 6 feet from Hitler's legs. He then made an excuse. "I must take a phone call." He walked out of the room. He was waiting. Inside, an officer, Colonel Brandt, wanted to get closer to the map. Stauffenberg's briefcase was in his way. He leaned down, picked it up, and moved it. He moved it to the other side of the table's thick oak leg. A solid block of wood now stood between Adolf Hitler and the bomb. At 12:42 p.m., the bomb exploded. The hut was annihilated. It was a storm of smoke and splinters and fire. Stauffenberg watched from a distance. He saw a body being carried out on a stretcher, covered in Hitler's cloak. He saw chaos. He was convinced no one could have survived. He was convinced Hitler was dead. He bluffed his way past 3 checkpoints and got on a plane back to Berlin. For 3 hours, he was in the air. 3 crucial hours of silence. While he was flying, the coup was supposed to be starting. But in Berlin, the other conspirators at the Bendler block, the army headquarters, were paralyzed. They were hesitating. General Ulbricht refused to trigger Operation Valkyrie until he had 100% confirmation that Hitler was dead. The Hitler is dead confirmation was on Stauffenberg's plane. But a different message did get through. From the Wolf's Lair. From a general who survived. The message, the Führer, is alive. He was alive. The blast had blown him across the room. His eardrums were shattered. His trousers were in ribbons. But the oak table leg had saved his life. He was alive. When Stauffenberg finally landed in Berlin at 4:30 p.m., he was horrified. Nothing had been done. No one had triggered Valkyrie. He stormed into the Bendler block and screamed, "Hitler is dead! I saw it myself." He and his co-conspirators finally triggered the coup. They arrested the loyalist general. They started making the calls. Trigger Valkyrie, seize Paris, seize Vienna. But it was too late. The lie, Hitler is dead, was now fighting the truth. Hitler is alive. And the truth was winning. In Berlin, a loyalist officer, Major Remmer, was ordered by the conspirators to arrest Joseph Goebbels. Remmer arrived at Goebbels's office. Goebbels, a master of propaganda, simply put in a phone call. He handed the phone to Remmer. "Do you know who this is?" And on the line was the voice of Adolf Hitler. Hitler promoted Remmer on the spot and ordered him to crush the coup. By 9 p.m., the jig was up. The Bendler block was in a firefight. A coup and a counter-coup in the same building. The conspirators were overwhelmed. Stauffenberg was shot in the shoulder. They were all arrested. The loyalist General Fromm, who had known about the plot and done nothing, now needed to cover his tracks. He convened a summary court-martial at midnight. He sentenced Stauffenberg and 3 others to death. He needed them silent. They were marched into the courtyard of the Bendler block. They were shot by a firing squad in the headlights of a truck. Stauffenberg's last words as the bullets hit him were, "Long live our sacred Germany." The plot was over, but the vengeance was just beginning. Hitler was not merciful. He was apocalyptic. He screamed for Sippenhaft. Blood guilt. The families of the conspirators were arrested. Their children were put in orphanages under new names. The Gestapo arrested 7,000 people. The main conspirators were not shot. They were put on show trials before the People's Court, led by the fanatical, screaming Nazi judge Roland Freisler. They were stripped of their belts and given ill-fitting trousers. Freisler screamed at them, humiliated them. "You are a pig!" And their execution was ordered by Hitler himself. They were to be hanged like cattle. At Plötzensee prison in Berlin, they were strangled. They were hanged with piano wire, looped over meat hooks, slowly. And the entire execution was filmed, for Adolf Hitler to watch. Admiral Canaris and Hans Oster, who had been arrested before the plot, were now implicated. They were held until April 9, 1945, days before the Americans liberated their camp. They were stripped naked, marched to the gallows, and hanged. The Black Orchestra was dead. It was a total failure. It did not stop the war. It did not save Germany. It accelerated the Götterdämmerung, the twilight of the gods, that Hitler wanted. It killed the best and brightest of the old Germany. The war would grind on for another 10 bloody months. And as the Reich crumbled, as the Red Army closed in from the east and the Allies from the west, a new, frantic shadow war was beginning. It was a race for the secrets of the Third Reich, a race for its scientists, its weapons, and above all, a race for the one weapon the SOE had delayed, but that the Allies were now mastering. In the next episode of the Shadow War, we explore the greatest scientific heist in history: the spies, the sabotage, and the desperate hunt for the atomic bomb. In 1938, in a laboratory in Berlin, two German chemists, Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann, did the impossible. They split the atom. They had, unwittingly, unlocked the fundamental power of the universe. The news spread through the physics community like a shock wave. It landed on the desk of President Franklin D. Roosevelt in the form of a letter signed by Albert Einstein. Einstein, the refugee, warned the president that the Nazis now possessed the theoretical key to a weapon of unimaginable power, a single bomb that could destroy an entire city, a bomb that ran on the same engine as the sun. And so, a new shadow war began. A race. This was not a race of armies or spies in the traditional sense. This was a race of minds. On one side was Werner Heisenberg, the golden boy of German physics, a Nobel laureate, the leader of the Uranium Club, the Nazi atomic bomb program. On the other was J. Robert Oppenheimer, the brilliant, troubled, charismatic director of a secret city, built in the middle of a desert in New Mexico. A place called Los Alamos. This is the story of that race. It is the story of the Allied mission to find out, how close is Hitler? It is the story of the spies sent to sabotage and even assassinate the German scientists. And it is the story of the other secret race, the race of the Soviets to steal the secret from everyone. This is the race for the sun. From 1939 to 1943, the Allies were flying blind. They knew about the German program. They knew, as we saw in Hour 4, that the Nazis were producing heavy water at the Vemork plant in Norway. The SOE and the Norwegian commandos had stopped that. But that was just one pathway. What else were they doing? General Leslie Groves, the military head of the Manhattan Project, was a man consumed by a single, terrifying question. What does Heisenberg know? If the Nazis got the bomb first, all of it, D-Day, Bletchley Park, the entire war, would be meaningless. Groves needed answers. He created his own private intelligence unit, a team of scientists, soldiers, and spies. It was called the Alsos mission. Alsos is Greek for grove. It was the Grove's mission. Their leader was Lieutenant Colonel Boris Pash, a tough, Russian-born, anti-communist counterintelligence officer. Their job was to follow the Allied invasion force right on its heels. Their mission, to seize German scientists, to steal their documents, to capture their uranium, and to deny all of it to the one ally they didn't trust, the Soviet Union. The Alsos mission began in Italy in 1943. They found nothing, just some low-level university research. The real target was Germany. But as they waited for D-Day, the paranoia in Washington grew. The head of the OSS, William Wild Bill Donovan, decided they could not wait for Alsos. They needed to stop Heisenberg. Now. And they had a plan. A plan to send an assassin. The man they chose was, perhaps, the strangest operative in the entire war. His name was Morris Moe Berg. Moe Berg was a polyglot who spoke a dozen languages. He was a graduate of Princeton and Columbia Law. And he was a Major League Baseball catcher. He was brilliant, eccentric, and utterly fearless. He was the catcher who was a spy. In December 1944, the OSS got a tip. Werner Heisenberg was leaving Germany. He was traveling to neutral Switzerland to give a physics lecture. This was the chance. Moe Berg was smuggled into Zurich. In his pocket was a .45 caliber pistol, and in his other pocket, a cyanide capsule. His mission was simple. Go to the lecture. Listen to Heisenberg. Determine if the Germans were close to a bomb. If they were, Berg was to shoot Werner Heisenberg on the spot and then swallow the cyanide pill. It was a suicide mission. Imagine the scene, a dark lecture hall in Zurich. Moe Berg, the baseball player, sits surrounded by Swiss physics students and, probably, Gestapo agents. He is listening to one of the greatest minds in the world talk about S-matrix theory. He is trying to translate high-level nuclear physics in his head, looking for one word: bomb, weapon, reactor. He has his hand on the gun in his pocket. The lecture ends. Berg is unsure. Heisenberg hadn't said the word, but the OSS had a backup plan. Berg was invited to a dinner party with Heisenberg that night. This was it. Berg goes to the party. He sits with Heisenberg. He talks to him. He walks him back to his hotel on a dark Zurich street. This is the moment. The fate of the world comes down to one baseball player and one physicist on a dark street. Berg makes a call. He decides, based on his feeling, based on Heisenberg's tone, that the German program is not close, that Heisenberg is not a threat. He does not pull the trigger. He lets him go. It was an astounding guess, and, as the Alsos mission would soon find out, it was 100% correct. In the spring of 1945, as the Reich collapsed, Colonel Pash and the Alsos team went on a rampage. They were in a race with the French and the Soviets. They crossed behind enemy lines to a small German town. And they found it. They found the entire German nuclear reactor. It was hidden in a wine cellar. It was a pathetic pickle barrel experiment. A lattice of uranium cubes hanging in a vat of heavy water. It had never even gone critical. It was a failure. Heisenberg was a genius, but a terrible project manager. The Germans had no bomb. They had no chance of a bomb. The entire race had been a phantom. Heisenberg was captured by Pash in the mountains. The Allies had won. The Manhattan Project was safe. J. Robert Oppenheimer was the only man on the planet who had the weapon. On July 16, 1945, in the desert of New Mexico, the Trinity test detonated. Oppenheimer watched as the sun rose twice. He thought of a line from the Bhagavad Gita. Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. The secret was out. Or so they thought. The British took Heisenberg and 9 other top German scientists and interned them in a bugged English country house called Farm Hall. This was Operation Epsilon. For 6 months, the Allies listened to everything they said. And on August 6, 1945, the German scientists were listening to the BBC radio news. The announcer came on. A single bomb was dropped on the Japanese city of Hiroshima. The bomb was atomic. The secret recordings from Farm Hall are chilling. At first, the Germans don't believe it. A hoax, says Otto Hahn. Heisenberg is convinced it's propaganda. He proves on a blackboard that it's impossible. He says the critical mass would be tons. But as the details come in, their disbelief turns to shock. And then to shame. Otto Hahn, the man who discovered fission, collapses, weeping. He feels responsible for the deaths. Heisenberg is humiliated. They, the Americans, the physicists he considered inferior, had done it. And he, the Nobel laureate, had failed. He had failed to even understand how it worked. The Farm Hall tapes proved the truth. The Allies were not in a race with Germany, but they were in a race with someone else. The Manhattan Project was the best-kept secret in the world. It was a city of 100,000 people, hidden from the world. General Groves had perfected security, compartmentalization, lie detectors, mail censorship. No one in could talk out. But he had failed. Because the greatest threat was not from the outside. It was already on the inside. His name was Klaus Fuchs. He was a German physicist, a communist. He had fled the Nazis to Britain, and he had been assigned to the British atomic program. Immediately, he volunteered his services to the Soviet Union. He was an ideological spy. He believed the Soviets deserved to have the bomb. That one capitalist nation should not have a monopoly on death. In 1943, Fuchs was sent to America. He was assigned to Los Alamos. General Groves had just invited the vampire into the house. For 2 years, Klaus Fuchs sat in the most secret meetings. He was brilliant. He was trusted. He was a key part of the implosion division. The team that was solving the puzzle of the plutonium bomb, the Fat Man bomb, and everything he learned, he wrote down. He would meet his Soviet handler, Raymond Harry Gold, on a bridge in Santa Fe, and he gave them everything. He gave them the exact mathematical design for the implosion lens. He gave them the physics of Trinity. He gave them the blueprints for Fat Man. He gave Stalin the atomic bomb. And he was not alone. A second spy was at Los Alamos, a young American physicist, Theodore Hall. He also volunteered. He also gave them the implosion secrets. The Soviets were getting the same information from 2 different sources. The race was a sham. Oppenheimer thought he was in a race with Heisenberg. He was actually just the lead researcher for the Soviet Union. On August 29, 1949, 4 years after Hiroshima, and years sooner than any American dreamed was possible, the Soviet Union detonated its first atomic bomb. Joe 1. It was a carbon copy, a perfect replica, of the Fat Man bomb dropped on Nagasaki. The design Klaus Fuchs had delivered. The world changed. The American monopoly was over. The Cold War began. Klaus Fuchs was finally caught in 1950, not by a spy on the ground, but by the ghosts in the machine from Hour 2, the Venona Project. The Allied codebreakers had been reading Soviet cables, and in the noise, they found a mole, codename Rest. It led to Klaus Fuchs. He confessed everything. He served 9 years in prison and then moved to East Germany, where he was hailed as a hero. The Shadow War was over, but a new shadow was looming. The shadow of the mushroom cloud, a shadow made possible by traitors and spies and idealists. But the atomic bomb was not the only secret the Nazis had. They had others. Rockets that could touch space, jets that could outrun sound, nerve gas that could kill a city. The scientists who built these were now captives, and the Allies, the Americans, the British, the Soviets, were about to fight over them. A new kind of heist, not for gold, but for brains. In the next episode of the Shadow War, we explore the moral compromise, the dark bargain at the end of the war. The secret program to snatch Nazi scientists, to whitewash their pasts, and to use their genius to build the arsenal for the next war. This is the story of Operation Paperclip, July 20th, 1969. The world holds its breath. 600 million people are watching a grainy, black and white image. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. It is, perhaps, the single greatest technological achievement in human history. A moment of pure, unified triumph. It was a victory conceived at the Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville, Alabama. It was a victory launched from the Kennedy Space Center in Cape Canaveral, Florida. And it was a victory achieved by one machine, the Saturn V, the most powerful rocket ever built. The men who ran this victory were American heroes. The director of the Kennedy Space Center, the man who presided over every single Apollo launch, was Dr. Kurt DeBus. The chief architect of the Saturn V rocket, the man who built the machine that touched the moon, was Dr. Arthur Rudolph. And the visionary, the public face of NASA, the genius who sold the dream to the world, and the first director of the Marshall Space Flight Center, was Dr. Wernher von Braun. We know their names. We celebrate their achievement. But we have forgotten who they were. We have forgotten the bargain. To find the true origin of the Apollo program, you don't go to Florida, or Alabama, or Houston. You go to 1945, to the smoking ruins of the Third Reich. You go to a dark, wet tunnel dug into the Harz Mountains. You go to a concentration camp called Mittelbau-Dora. And you go to a secret American military program with a cynical name, Operation Paperclip. This is the story of the Devil's Bargain, the moral compromise that won the space race before it even began. In the spring of 1945, the war in Europe was over. But, as we saw in the last hour, a new, secret war was raging. The heist of the century. The Allied armies were no longer fighting the Reich. They were scavenging its corpse. And the grand prize was not gold. It was brains. The American Alsos mission was racing the Soviets to find the atomic secrets. But there was another weapon. A weapon that had terrified London. A 46-foot-tall ballistic missile that fell from the edge of space at 3 times the speed of sound. The V2. The vengeance weapon. The V2 was a terror in 1945. But the Pentagon knew a V2 with an atomic warhead was the future of war. The Soviets knew this too. The race was on. Not to build this weapon, but to capture the men who had already built it. The leader of this team was the 33-year-old, aristocratic, charismatic Wernher von Braun. Von Braun was a visionary. He didn't care about the war. He cared about space. And in May 1945, he made a choice. He saw the Red Army advancing, and he took his entire 500-person engineering team, his research, his blueprints, and he fled south. He fled past the SS guards who had orders to kill them all. And he surrendered to the Americans. His brother, Magnus, rode a bicycle down a mountain, waved down a U.S. soldier, and said, "My brother invented the V2. We want to surrender to you." It was a miracle. It was the greatest intelligence prize of the war. The entire German ballistic missile program had gift-wrapped itself and delivered itself to the U.S. Army. The Pentagon was ecstatic. They immediately launched Operation Overcast to bring von Braun and 100 of his top scientists to America, to build rockets for the U.S. Army at Fort Bliss, Texas. But there was a problem, a moral problem. President Harry S. Truman was also launching the Nuremberg trials. He knew the world was watching. He signed a direct order. This new program must exclude any member of the Nazi Party who was more than a nominal participant, or any person guilty of atrocities. The line was clear: no war criminals, no ardent Nazis. The investigators at the Office of Military Government, U.S., OMGUS, began to run the background checks, and the files that came back were not just bad, they were horrifying. The investigators followed the trail of the V2 back to its factory. The factory was not a building. It was hell. It was Mittelwerk, an underground complex of tunnels dug into a mountain by slaves. The 60,000 laborers came from the Mittelbau-Dora concentration camp. They lived in the tunnels. They never saw daylight. They slept on wooden bunks crawling with lice. They starved as they worked 24 hours a day. The SS guards who ran the camp hanged prisoners from cranes above the assembly line as a warning against sabotage. The dust and filth meant death came slowly from disease or quickly from a beating. 20,000 people died at Mittelwerk. More people died building the V2 than died from it being used as a weapon. This was not a factory. It was an extermination camp disguised as an assembly line. And who ran it? The OMGUS investigators found the names. The operations director of the Mittelwerk plant, the man who ran the day-to-day slave labor, the man who had recommended using concentration camp labor in the first place. His name was Dr. Arthur Rudolph, the V-Weapons flight test director, a man appointed personally by Hitler, a man who was an SA stormtrooper in 1933, a man who was a member of the SS. His name was Dr. Kurt Debus, and the technical director of the entire program. The visionary, the genius, the man who walked through the tunnels, the man who saw the walking skeletons, the man who personally traveled to the Buchenwald concentration camp to hand-select skilled prisoners for his factory, a man who was a card-carrying major in the SS. His name was Dr. Werner von Braun. These three men, the heroes of our intro, were not nominal participants. They were at the very heart of the Nazi slave labor machine. They were war criminals by President Truman's own definition. The files landed on the desk of the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, JIOA, in the Pentagon. They had a problem. Their orders said no. Their duty to stop the Soviets said yes. So the U.S. military made a choice. They chose to lie. They created a new secret program. They renamed Overcast to Operation Paperclip. And they began to whitewash history. When the damning file for a valuable scientist came in, the JIOA officers buried it. They wrote a new summary. They erased the SS ranks. They erased the trips to Buchenwald. They erased the reports from Mittelwerk. They declared SS Major von Braun a man who had no Nazi sympathies. They declared Kurt Debus not a security threat. And the name Paperclip? It was literal. They took the new falsified document and paper-clipped it over the top of the old, truthful file. The lie was literally attached to the truth. By 1947, 1,600 of these whitewashed scientists and their families were smuggled into the United States. Given new identities, new jobs, they were hidden at Fort Bliss, Texas, to build America's future. The bargain was made. Von Braun's team built the Redstone rocket, but the secret held. They were kept in the shadows. Until October 4th, 1957, the beep, beep, beep of Sputnik 1. The Soviets had beaten America to space, using their own captured German scientists. Panic gripped America. The space race was on. And suddenly, America realized it had an ace in the hole. It had the paperclip team. Overnight, Wernher von Braun was transformed. He was no longer a secret. He was a hero. He was on the cover of Time magazine. He was on television with Walt Disney, a charming visionary selling the dream of space to American children. His SS uniform was forgotten. His past was erased. The government created NASA and made Wernher von Braun the first director of the Marshall Space Flight Center. They made Kurt Debus the first director of the Kennedy Space Center. They made Arthur Rudolph the project director for the most important machine on Earth, the Saturn V moon rocket. Which brings us back to July 20th, 1969. The world is watching. The Saturn V, Rudolph's rocket, launches from KSC, Debus's complex, powered by the genius of von Braun's team. It is the greatest triumph of American technology, a victory for all mankind. It was a victory built on a lie, a victory powered by a Faustian bargain, a victory paid for by the ghosts of 20,000 slaves who died in a tunnel in Germany, looking at the parts of a rocket that their masters would one day ride all the way to the moon. The lie held for decades, until the 1980s, when the Justice Department finally reopened the files. The paperclips came off. Wernher von Braun was dead. He died an American hero. But Arthur Rudolph, the slave master of Mittelwerk, was alive. In 1984, he was confronted with the evidence, and the man who built the moon rocket was forced to renounce his U.S. citizenship and was quietly deported. A small footnote to a deal with the devil. Operation Paperclip was the bargain America made to secure the useful criminals, the scientists. But what about the other ones? The men who weren't useful? The doctors of Auschwitz, the commandants of Treblinka, the architects of the Holocaust itself. They weren't given contracts. They were hunted. Or were they? In the final episode of the Shadow War, we follow the final secret network. The network built not by spies, but by priests. The secret escape route that smuggled thousands of history's worst monsters to safety. This is the story of the rat lines. In 1945, the war ended. The concentration camps were liberated. The world finally saw. They saw the skeletal survivors. They saw the mountains of shoes, of hair, of gold fillings. They saw the gas chambers, and the Allies made a vow: never again. They convened a new kind of trial, the Nuremberg trials. They would hold the architects of this industrialized evil to account. They tried Göring. They tried Hess. They tried the High Command. It was justice, but this was just the top. What about the thousands of other men? The commandants of the camps, the doctors from Auschwitz, the SS officers who had pulled the triggers. What happened to them? In the chaos of Germany's collapse, thousands of them vanished. They shaved their mustaches. They burned their uniforms. They took the names of dead soldiers. They simply melted into the millions of refugees, and they ran. This is the final story of the Shadow War. It is not a war of armies. It is the story of the escape, the story of the secret networks that smuggled mass murderers to safety. They were called the rat lines. And this is the story of the men who hunted them in the shadows for 50 years. This is the story of the Nazi hunters. The first question is, how? How does a wanted SS captain from Poland end up as a carpenter in Argentina? He needed help. He needed an organization. And the organization that helped them was in the one place no one dared to look: the Vatican. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is documented fact. A network of priests and bishops inside the Vatican Bank, led by an Austrian bishop named Alois Hudal, began to move these men. Hudal was a Nazi sympathizer. He believed he was not saving monsters. He believed he was saving anti-communist soldiers who would be needed for the next war against Stalin. The rat line worked like this. An SS man would make his way to Rome. He would be hidden in a monastery. Bishop Hudal's network would provide him with a new identity. They would give him a Red Cross passport, a fake document that claimed he was a stateless refugee from Italy. With this passport, he could get on a boat to a friendly country, a country that welcomed anti-communist veterans, a country like Argentina, ruled by Juan Perón. And who used this rat line? Franz Stengel, the commandant of the Treblinka and Sobibor death camps, the man who murdered 900,000 people. He escaped to Syria and then Brazil. Josef Mengele, the angel of death from Auschwitz, the doctor who performed ghastly experiments on children. He escaped to Argentina. Klaus Barbie, the butcher of Lyon, the Gestapo chief who tortured and murdered the French resistance from Hour 4. He escaped to Bolivia. And, as we now know, Barbie was protected and hired by American counterintelligence to fight communists. Another dark bargain. Thousands more vanished. They started new families. They grew old. They lived in peace. The world, it seemed, had forgotten. But some people did not forget. The survivors. The men and women who had lost everyone. They had no army. They had no government. They had only memory and names. They became the hunters. The most famous was a man named Simon Wiesenthal, an Austrian architect, a survivor of Mauthausen. He lost 89 members of his family in the Holocaust. When he was liberated, he was a skeleton. But instead of rebuilding his life, he gave his life to one thing: justice, not vengeance. He opened a small office, the Jewish Historical Documentation Center, and he began to hunt. He gathered witness reports. He matched photos. He followed every rumor. He was a detective for the dead. It was Wiesenthal who found Franz Stengel, the commandant, working at a Volkswagen factory in Brazil. Stengel was extradited. He died in prison. But there was one name, the one that got away, the one that mattered. The man who was not a brute. He was a bureaucrat. He was the man who organized the trains, the man who made the lists, the man who managed the final solution. He was the architect of the Holocaust. His name was Adolf Eichmann. Eichmann had vanished. He had used the rat line. He fled to Argentina. He was living in Buenos Aires, under a new name, Ricardo Clement. He was a foreman at a Mercedes-Benz factory. He was living in a shack, a quiet neighbor, the man next door. The world couldn't find him, but one man did. A blind German Jewish prosecutor named Fritz Bauer. Bauer got a tip from a man in Argentina whose daughter was dating a young man. a young man named Klaus Eichmann, who was bragging that his father was a famous Nazi. Fritz Bauer knew this was it, but he couldn't go to the German police. He knew it was still full of old Nazis. They would tip Eichmann off. So Bauer committed treason. He flew to Israel, and he told the Mossad. The head of the Mossad, Isser Harel, did not believe it. But he sent a team, just to look. They found Ricardo Clement. They watched him. They matched his photo. They checked his habits. They knew. It was him. Now what? Argentina would never extradite him. So the Prime Minister of Israel, David Ben-Gurion, made a decision. The same ungentlemanly decision that Churchill had made in 1940. They would break international law. They would kidnap him. This was Operation Finale. On May 11, 1960, a team of Mossad agents, led by a legendary operative named Peter Malkin, waited in the dark on a street corner. Adolf Eichmann, Ricardo Clement, got off his bus. He walked home. The team grabbed him. They tackled him. Malkin shoved a gloved hand into his mouth to stop him from swallowing a cyanide pill. They threw him into a car. If you move, you are shot. They drove him to a safe house. For 9 days, they held him. They verified his identity. His SS blood-type tattoo had been burned off. They waited for their chance. The El Al airline was in Argentina for an official state visit. The Mossad team drugged Adolf Eichmann. They dressed him in an El Al flight attendant's uniform. They told the Argentine guards that he was a steward who was drunk. They walked him past security. They put him on the plane, and they flew him to Jerusalem. The world erupted. Argentina was furious, but Israel had him, and in 1961 they put him on trial. It was not like Nuremberg. This was different. This was the first televised trial in history. The survivors came. One by one, they stood in the courtroom, and they told their story. To him, to the man in the glass booth, to the world. The world finally learned the truth. From the mouths of the victims. Eichmann's defense was simple. I was not an anti-Semite. I was just following orders. I was a bureaucrat. The philosopher Hannah Arendt, watching the trial, coined a phrase for it. The banality of evil. She realized the worst monster in the world was not a frothing sadist. He was a boring middle manager, a man who cared more about his pension than mass murder. A man who saw people as numbers on a ledger. Adolf Eichmann was found guilty. He was hanged in 1962, the only person to ever be judicially executed by the State of Israel. The Shadow War did not end in 1945. It never ends. It just changes. It changed from a war of bombs to a war of codes, from codes to lies, from lies to sabotage, from sabotage to treason, from treason to science, from science to a dark bargain, and from a bargain to a manhunt, a hunt for justice in a world that wanted to forget. The shadows of this war, the technology, the espionage, the moral compromises. They built the world we live in, the atomic age, the space age, the age of mass surveillance. The shadow war created our modern world, and those shadows are still with us. They are all around us. We just have to know where to look.